topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart.
Hello and welcome to It's Your Voice, the show that hosts enriching conversations in diversity and periodically on climate justice, climate resilience, climate change, climate solutions. And today we have a wonderful guest who's going to give us a lot of good information, Dr. Jonathan London, who I will introduce fully in just a moment, but I just want to let listeners and viewers know that if they're interested in my work that is related to diversity education and helping organizations align their values with their actions with their values, I often am hired to help organizations identify patterns of bias they are unconsciously perpetuating, to learn how to step out of those patterns and cultivate new patterns to create more belonging and more inclusion in their policies and their actions, which actually benefits everyone and makes people happier. So if you're interested in looking at that work, you can find samples of it on my website, which is called knowwhatyouvantcoaching.wordpress.com. So now to Dr. Jonathan London. Jonathan, why don't you come out now and I'll read your introduction so people can see who you are. And I also want to let listeners and viewers know that this is you're for real person. I know often people think people who are academic stay academic, but you're very much about community engagement, community involvement. So I just want to preface how much I appreciate your work in the world locally and distantly. And I'm going to read an introduction to let people know that Dr. Jonathan London is a professor and program director at UC Davis Department of Human Ecology, Community, and Regional Development. He's also the faculty director of Community Engagement Core at UC Davis Environmental Health Science Center, and clearly an educator, a researcher, and community builder with over 30 years of experience in participatory research, rural community development, and community engaged planning. And he has degrees in environmental studies from Brown University, city and regional planning, and rural sociology at UC Berkeley. Jonathan's research and teaching addresses conflicts and collaboration in natural resource and environmental policy, with a particular emphasis on environmental justice. And he has conducted action research on issues including from water justice to pesticide policy, sustainable community and regional planning, community air monitoring, and forest management. He also teaches a study abroad course on participatory rural development in Nepal. Jonathan was the founding director of the UC Davis Center for Regional Change and now co-directs the Community Engagement Core of the UC Davis Environmental Health Science Center, where he connects researchers and community leaders for collaborative research to understand and reduce health inequities. Thank you so much for what you do. Is there anything you want to add or say about the introduction?
No, that was wonderful. Thanks so much. Very, very kind. I'm really glad to be with you today, Baya.
And I know that some of our listeners and viewers, periodically people ask me, what is environmental racism? When you say environmental justice, what does that mean exactly? So I'd love it if you could just break those two terms down for us, just to make it more concrete for people who just really care and want to deepen their understanding.
Yeah, excellent question. So environmental justice is seeking the end of racial and ethnic and class-based discrimination and other modes of discrimination that target disadvantaged communities and overburden them with environmental risks and hazards, and also systematically deprive them of access to healthy resources, good food, jobs, schools, places to recreate. And then thirdly, systematically exclude them from decision-making about their lives. So environmental justice is really seeking to change those circumstances and make sure that traditionally disadvantaged communities have access to all the resources they need to live healthy, sustainable, equitable, and happy lives.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
So I would love to just move into your own research on environmental justice and the one specific study you've been following for 6 years on related to air quality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Based on a study of overburdened communities in California and a law that you made me aware of in California. So can you please frame that for us and let us know what you're seeing and how well it's addressing the purpose of the new law?
Yeah, thanks for that opportunity. I'll start perhaps a little bit more broadly, and you mentioned this a little bit in the introduction, but I've been conducting research on environmental justice issues for a number of decades now, and in all of those projects, whether it focuses on air quality, which I'll discuss, or things like pesticides, or water quality, or housing, transportation, land use, in all those cases, I really focus on the different kind of systems that are making these kinds of communities unhealthy and unsustainable, and also really working with environmental justice activists on the front lines who are trying to protect their communities, to lift them up, to get access to resources, and working in a participatory, collaborative way with those organizations. And I really think that's important, that university and researchers and other researchers really take their lead from the groups that are really struggling with those issues, A, and B, also have the capacities and the knowledge necessary to really change the facts on the ground. As researchers, we certainly have a range of different expertise, but generally one of them is not community organizing. So instead of trying to do that myself, and I wouldn't be very good at it probably, I greatly value the partnerships that I have with community organizers who really help inform what the issues are that the research should focus on. In many cases are involved in the data collection, and certainly in reviewing, and in some cases co-authoring the publications, and always being involved in applying that and moving that into action, whether it's, again, getting access to clean drinking water for disadvantaged communities, or making sure that land uses are targeting already overburdened communities, or pesticides aren't being applied inequitably, affecting, say, farm worker communities in the Central Valley of California, where I've worked extensively. So that kind of participatory, engaged scholarship model is really important to me, and I recommend it to other researchers and students who are thinking about getting in the research world. So then, in terms of the specific, in terms of the specific,
I was going to ask you, actually.
Go ahead, please.
I'm sorry, we're having a little delay, and I think we might have missed a few of your words. So I just really want to emphasize your point and ask you to reiterate it in case it was lost. We're having a couple of little technical glitches, and apologize for that. Your emphasis on that academic scholars can't be everything, and how important it is to connect to community organizers who do know the on the ground organizing work and that kind of collaboration. Can you just emphasize that point again? Regardless, it's just important to hear again.
Yeah, well, I think it actually relates nicely to the theme of your show. It's your voice. So there's a phrase in the environmental justice movement, which is we speak for ourselves. And the idea that those who are most affected by an issue really need to be front and center in being represented in any kind of research or any kind of policy that's addressing those issues. This is not for outsiders to decide. It really is for the community members themselves to lead. And so that goes for my own work as a researcher. And then another part of environmental justice is really respect for a variety of different kinds of knowledge. So whether that's research knowledge like I'm producing, or people's embodied knowledge, about just their own experiences in the world and the effects that the environment has on their bodies and their communities. Indigenous knowledge and different ways of knowing, different than the traditional Western scientific models, but thinking about indigenous ecological knowledge and indigenous traditions. All of those are really important dimensions that place traditional research knowledge as one part of a much larger ecosystem of knowledge. And that's what I try to contribute to.
Wonderful. Thank you for just spelling that out even more.
Great. Happy to do that.
And emphasizing it. So now
yeah.
I don't think I can. So feel free to tell us about the specific 6-year study or any other aspect of I'll try not to interrupt you again.
Sorry. Yeah. I think our internets are not quite talking with each other well. Yeah. So the study that you've mentioned is one that I have been working on since 2018 with a really wonderful set of research partners and community partners and public agencies. And it's looking at a California state bill. It's called Assembly Bill 617 or AB 617. And it is one of the state's leading policies to address inequities in air pollution in the state's most overburdened communities. And it does that through selecting a set, there are now 19 of them throughout the state, of communities that can really be learning living laboratories for intensive investments in community participation and also air protection programs and air protection policies. So we're really interested in seeing how well AB 617 is meeting its really ambitious and transformative goals. And those goals being about community voice and community power building, and also addressing these kinds of air quality inequities. So over the last 6 years now, with partnerships from the California Air Resources Board, that's the state agency responsible for administrating the policy, as well as regional air districts throughout the state, and community partners, we've been looking at how well the policy is in fact managing to achieve its goals. And so we've done that through interviews with key stakeholders, through observing hundreds of community meetings and analyzing all the different clean air plans. And we found a number of things, some that really speak to the positive impacts and successes of the policy, and in some cases areas of challenge and ways that the policy can be improved in implementation. In terms of the things that have been successful, there really has been an increase in community voice and partnerships where there had been significant conflict. The conflict is not resolved fully, but there are more instances of collaboration between community organizations and residents on the one hand, and the regional and state agencies on the other. It's really a forum for dialogue, and people have talked about how, when you're working face to face and hand in hand with people, it's a lot easier to be in a more collaborative relationship, as opposed to when you're just on, up on a dais where the policymakers are, and down making 3-minute comments in the community space, but really kind of around a common decision-making table. So we found that that's been quite successful, although to different degrees in different places, but overall successful in changing those kinds of relationships. We found that the plans that have been developed have some really visionary and ambitious scale to them. So things, for example, like electrifying the diesel fleets and other vehicles at some of the largest ports in the world, truly. The Long Beach, Wilmington port in Southern California, and the port in San Diego, and up here in Oakland as well, in Northern California where I am. So these can be really major polluters of these environmental justice communities, and there's some really innovative work to reduce those pollution burdens from the ports. Things like getting diesel trucks out of residential neighborhoods, putting in vegetative barriers, so even if there is air pollution, it's being filtered and the communities are being protected. Changing refinery and emissions rules for toxic emitters of different sorts of facilities. So some really ambitious actions in things that they call community emission management plans, or community emission reduction plans, excuse me. So that's been very exciting. One of the things we found that's been particularly challenging is the implementation of those plans. And that's really what's happening now in many of these places, and what we're focused on. There have been a lot of delays in getting things moving. There have been opposition in some cases to elements of the plan from other local and regional officials that find it against their interests, or the industries that they're engaged with interests. And then there's also a problem that we've seen as what we're calling a complex ecosystem of implementation, by which we mean that there are all of these different entities: local governments, state governments, corporations, transportation districts, ports, and so on, that weren't part of the original policy, but need to be involved in the implementation, and coordinating all of them, getting the resources they need, making sure that they fit all the different interests. That's been the really challenging part. It's also exciting, but there really is a lot more that needs to be done to help move from idea to action.
Wow. Well, for that particular challenge, do you see that, well, I'm sure it involves collaboration from all partners, but do you see, is that more of the role of community organizing and facilitating, or is that what do you see as the best ways to address the biggest challenges there? Like how, is there someone who continues to lead the dialogue and keep the communication going? Is that do you have a facilitator in every area?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll answer that kind of from the broad scope, and then come to your more specific question there at the end. So at the broadest level, I like to invoke Frederick Douglass, who said that power seeds nothing on its own, but is only, I'm paraphrasing someone badly here, but that power conceives nothing on its own, but needs to be basically pushed or forced into it. And that comes from communities themselves. The government will look after the government's interests. Corporations will look after the corporate interests, but it's really up to the communities to look after their interests and compel the government and compel industry to comply with their needs and desires. And so the community groups really have been crucial and central to moving this policy forward. They've been the ones really setting, and when it works best, they've been the ones that have really been setting the agenda of what kind of issues are really the most important ones to be addressed in a given location. They've been the ones that have been able to identify some of the most innovative solutions to address those different kinds of issues. In many cases, they've been the ones that have figured out how to maneuver politically to get these things done. So they're really bringing a great amount of wisdom and political savvy, and in some cases also political power to bear. So that's a really important dimension of the larger picture, and that goes for, I think, most social justice policies across the way, across the board. In this case, one of the things that the state agencies and the regional air districts have learned is that they really do need outside skilled facilitators. In the early days of the policy, in some cases, the air districts were facilitating the meetings themselves. In some cases, there were facilitators who just didn't quite have the cultural competency and the skill set to navigate these complex and sometimes conflictual dynamics. Now, 6 years in, most of the places have very skilled facilitators with excellent multilingual translation, with really good techniques of community participation, of conflict resolution, making sure that the most marginalized voices really are centered. So that's been a major learning, and I think largely a success. And I do think that is a nice example that other agencies and in other policy settings can learn from. That sometimes the policymakers are not the best people to facilitating these processes. They could really use this outside help. I will also say that in a number of the communities, they've had community organizations that are also stepping up in a co-lead way to be able to have that kind of direct leadership role, and that's been very important. Instead of just having them be participants, that they really are playing lead roles in structuring the agendas and carrying them out.
That is so encouraging to hear about.
Mm-hmm.
It's so inspiring, and I love your paraphrasing of Frederick Douglass and the emphasis of the communities need to compel for themselves, for their advocacy, and that we can they need to compel governments, they need to compel corporations and industries. That's such an important aspect, because we can live with the kind of the false notion that governments take care of us or corporations will be mindful of human rights, but clearly that has not happened overall, or we would be in the situations that we're in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, while there are many things, a lot of things that government agencies more recently have been doing to be protective of communities, to some significant degree, the problems that we see in communities confronted by environmental justice were produced by governments, whether those were places that were redlined, communities that were starved of resources, or places where government agencies made decisions to place toxic facilities or to run freeways through low-income, but in many cases thriving communities of color, and cut them off from each other and cut them off from key resources. These, in many cases, are government decisions that made, based on, you asked in the very beginning about environmental racism. So many of those decisions have been made, and to some degree, I would say, continue to be made on racist logics and racist decisions. That said, there really are some very important things that government agencies have. They have money. They have the power of law to compel and control industry. They have the ability to provide other kinds of resources and investments into these communities, and more that is happening in California. There's a wide number of laws that are being used to bring resources to disadvantaged communities, whether it's water, clean drinking water. There's been some major successes there. in regulating the oil and gas industry. That's affecting many of these communities, in banning pesticides that are affecting farm workers in the fields and in their homes. So there's some really progressive advances, and I would say also with the Biden administration, this has been an administration that has moved environmental justice more than any other administration in the history of the country, truly, with leadership in the federal agencies, with investments in the agency budgets, as well as enforcement and other kinds of policies. So there's a lot that can be done. There's a good bit that is being done, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And it's typically the community social movements that are leading the way.
Thanks for all this good information. It's great to hear that's ever been done, based on how much work needs to be done, and how this is like another very broad question. How do you feel California is leading? Because of course this is all over the country. How do you think California's doing?
Yeah, as I mentioned briefly, California really has been leading on a number of different fronts, and that's been going on for a long time. Environmentally, but also other things, labor law and social policy, welfare, and things like that. In terms of environment, there have been some really important advances. For example, in the last, I guess it's been about 5 years now, the state, with a lot of organizing from water justice advocates, passed what's called SAFER, a $1.3 billion fund to provide drinking water in disadvantaged communities across the state, because there are upwards to 1 million people who are not getting clean and safe and abundant drinking water when they turn on the tap each day. So the state has made this major commitment. Earlier than that, and that somewhat set that SAFER policy up, there was the recognition of a human right to water. That was 2012. And that also was the result of probably about a decade of water justice organizing. And the state recognized that water is not just a commodity or even just a service, but it really is a human right. And that's directed all relevant state agencies to ensure that human right is met. There's a long way to go, but that policy has been really important. There's new environmental justice tools that have been created that have then found their way out to be adopted and replicated in other states and in the national level as well. We have something called the Cal Enviro Screen, and that looks at the cumulative effects of environmental and social vulnerabilities on communities. And so you can really literally see from red to green, and the red areas are throughout the state are those that are most burdened by environmental hazards and have fewest social and economic resources and greatest vulnerabilities. And that's directed truly at this point billions of dollars to support protections and health equity improvements in the most disadvantaged communities. And now there are similar tools that the United States Environmental Protection Agency and the Biden White House have created to some significant degree, modeled after California's Cal Enviro Screen. So there is that, as I say, kind of ripple effect from California outwards.
That's great to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just want to acknowledge that the less I talk, the better. There's glitch on my side, not on
Okay.
Dr. Jonathan London. So everything you're saying is very valuable, but I wanted to ask you to feel free. Well, you also want to talk about something else that you're helping co-found that's local to anyone near in Davis, California, Davis Can. And I want to just hand it over to you to talk about that, so I don't interrupt you or when you're ready. I mean, there's plenty to say more about this. So.
Yeah, no, I'll happily do that, and then we can kind of bring the two pieces together a little bit more. So I am helping to form with a wide range of wonderful activists and community leaders in Davis in Northern California, something called the Davis Community Action Network, or Davis Can. And that is intended to create a new space that exists, that doesn't quite exist yet, but needs to exist. And we're building it at the convergence of activism and policy around climate justice on the one hand and affordable housing on the other. And very often conversations about one don't include the other, but need to. So when people are thinking about affordable housing, it's about getting low-income people into housing, which is critical. But it's sometimes not considered, well, what sort of housing? Is this climate smart housing? Is this housing that is going to have good and efficient heating and air systems? Will it have solar? Will it be near public transit? Will it be accessible to green and open spaces to reduce the heat islands that can happen when there's no tree cover and lots of asphalt, basically impervious surfaces. So what's the green, what's the climate justice quality of that affordable housing? And then on the other side, when people are thinking about climate change, sometimes it's about emissions from power plants or electric cars or solar on roofs. But it's not always thought about, well, who are the people who are most affected by climate change? And who are the people who are least getting least access to the resources to address that? So we're thinking about low-income people, outdoor workers, elderly people, people living with disabilities. They're all subject to significant threats from climate change, whether that's heat or drought or floods, storms. And so those populations, we could call them frontline communities, need to have their needs addressed. And housing is a crucial buffer to those sorts of climate threats. So simply having housing, addressing the massive, and I would even say shameful, housing homeless crisis is one part of affordable housing and climate justice, where unhoused people are some of the most at risk from climate change for obvious reasons. And then also housing where people are living in substandard housing, where there's not good air filtration, where people say have to have the windows open, so they're being affected by air pollution and heat and other kinds of climate related threats. So when we're thinking about climate, we need to think about housing. And when we're thinking about housing, we need to think about climate. And we've noticed that there are excellent activists in both sets of movements, but they haven't quite come together. And so Davis Can is really dedicated to bringing those movements together here in our small town of Davis. But we hope, and knowing you have a national and international audience, we hope that this can really be a model that can be used by other cities elsewhere around the country and around the world, where we're deep listening, we're coalition building, where visionary thinking and planning can come together to create these climate smart and equitable communities. And that really needs a holistic look at how all of these different social and infrastructure and economic systems come together.
That is so encouraging, and we need encouragement. The education that you're giving us on even this just summary level, I just find very hopeful, and I certainly believe Davis Can will be develop a model, and we'll definitely keep letting the world know about it. And we've got plenty of time. We have about good 15 minutes. So the more you speak, the more I learn.
Well, you want to be careful giving a mic either to a politician or an academic. You never know what you'll get.
Well, you're such an activist academic.
All right. Well, I'm trying to do credit to that, give credit to that. I will say perhaps, Bahia, a little bit more about connecting sort of the Davis-Can model to larger climate justice. So first off, which I didn't quite define up front when we were defining environmental justice. So climate justice is a connected closely to environmental justice, but it really does look at the communities that are first, worst affected and least engaged in climate decision making. And really looks, because it has to, at this local and global scale. The effects of climate change are produced locally, but kind of summed up globally, but then experienced locally again. So this kind of global, local scale needs to be really taken seriously. So that's sort of one systems level. Another, and this is sometimes called just transitions, is a way of thinking that starts with the problem that we just have to get off fossil fuels. We have to decarbonize everything. We have to decarbonize our homes. We need to decarbonize the government. We need to decarbonize the economy. And we have to recognize as that happens, because fossil fuels are, deep in the structure of everything that we do, and everything that we buy and that we eat and what we wear, and how we heat ourselves and move around in space, all of those things. So moving away from that kind of fossil-based economy is going to have huge disruptions. And one particular kind of disruption, which really needs to be addressed, is in the workforce in the fossil fuel industry, particular in terms of mining and refining and power production. And those are good jobs in terms of pay, not always the best in health conditions. It's important to say, but there's a lot of people who have moved up into the middle class by being in that oil and gas and fossil fuel industry. And so to really make sure this is not a regressive change and is not trading off one sort of injustice for another, there needs to be a just transition where people are able to be brought along into the green economy. So what if they're green jobs, are they also getting to the people who are going to potentially lose their jobs in these other sectors? And so is there retraining opportunities, apprenticeship opportunities, local hiring incentives, unionization of green collar jobs? And by green collar jobs, I mean things like renewable energy and, public transportation and, creating green housing systems, things like that, solar, wind, renewables, and so on. So as that green collar job economy increases, who is getting access to them? Is it the same communities that have been dispossessed and have been overburdened by the fossil fuel economy? If so, then that really is progress. If those communities are left out of the solutions, or even further disadvantaged by those solutions, that's not progressive. So a just transition really looks at that social and economic dimension as well as the environmental dimension. There's also the reality that a just transition is not just switching out, say, one fuel source for another. It's not just saying, well, we're going to do solar instead of coal, but the same systems are going to be in place. It'll still be dominated by large corporations. It will still be working without the voices and leadership of local communities. that's not a just transition. That may be a transition, but that's not an equitable, sustainable, and progressive one. So the just transition also involves devolving control from big corporations to municipalities, having energy co-ops, having municipal utilities, having other kinds of community scale innovations. So it's really changing that extractive, monopolized model to a much more democratic, sustainable, horizontally connected grassroots model. So all of those things are part of the just transitions. And so Davis Can is one small piece of that much bigger picture. But it really is important. And I would say both for our group here in Davis, but as other groups are struggling with these issues around the country and around the world, it could be really useful to place those local struggles in these larger frameworks of a just transition, just equitable, sustainable transition, and so that requires local organizing, but also scaling that local organizing to the state, to the national, and even global scales.
What a refreshing model to integrate all those aspects of human society and to have the broad vision of equitable, just, inclusive transition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That really spells it out even more. So what can people do, whether they live in Davis or elsewhere, and you can speak to each separately if need be, to help bring if this is resonating and this is sounding like healthy and hopeful and encouraging and I'm motivated, how can I be a part of this? What are some suggestions you have, whether someone's in Davis or elsewhere in the world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great question. What is to be done? I always try to work with my students on that, because it's really easy to just focus on the problems, and that can be really disempowering. And there's a lot of thinking now about things that people are calling like eco grief or climate grief. So there's this sense that we're in and contributing to the dying of the planet, and just how profound that is. I mean, what a fundamental sorrow it is to live in these times, and to not feel like we're perhaps equal to the task. And so the one of the things that I think it's really important to do is move beyond the level of the individual and to the level of the collective. So individually, there's certainly things we can do, and there are books about this, right? So reducing meat consumption, getting out of the cars, using bikes, public transportation, changing out fossil fuel based heating and air to solar and renewables. Looking at other sorts of consumption, actually clothing and fast fashion, sort of disposable based clothing is a huge source of environmental and climate change kinds of impacts. So there are definitely things people can do as an individual, but it's never going to be enough. It's really a structural issue with our economy and our politics addiction to oil, and to the influence of the fossil fuel industry on politics. And so there has to be action at that collective level. So there's been a huge movement in universities, but also local governments, about divesting from oil and gas. UC Davis and the UCs themselves have taken some really important steps. The city of Davis has done some really important divestment work, and that's had ripple effects, across the country, and many other countries that are probably more advanced than United States in divestment. But we need to really think about these, not just our thousands or even some set of thousands of dollars that we control at our household level, but at the levels of governments, at the billions and trillions of dollars, we still in this country subsidize oil and gas massively, and there's no good reason for it. Truly, at this point in time, there is no good reason to do that, and yet the politics are such that continues to happen. So what would happen, say, if we had a groundswell of, we have 300 plus million people in this country. What if there were, tens of millions of people who were organized together, lobbying, lobbying the government, lobbying there from local up to federal, to switch that kind of investment from fossil fuels to renewables. That could just have a huge effect. And so the lesson in response to your question, Baye, which is an excellent one, is, align yourself individually, but work collectively. Connect with social movements, connect with other organizations, try to link these things up into larger networks to scale to the size of the problem.
Thank you so much. It's really helpful to hear, such an accomplished scholar and researcher emphasize the importance of how to do that is getting to know and acknowledge the voices of the activists. And you're so right. Historically, activists are the ones who helped us create national parks or start saving spaces and start thinking. It does come from the ground up. So much in my understanding. And I just really appreciate how much you are validating the inclusion of voices of communities that are being directly impacted or who have the privilege of not being directly impacted, but have the freedom and the health to advocate for other communities and to align collectively, to take individual responsibility in those great specific ways you mentioned, and find a way to align with collective action. So much is possible. I love the your question of what would happen if there were a groundswell, because it's entirely possible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And big changes have made, and we are in a window of time where more and more people are listening and paying attention. If David's can, we all can.
There you go. That's the slogan, right? David's can, we all can. Exactly right. Yeah. I think you're right. And I think, podcasts like this and other sorts of resources can really help people educate themselves, so they understand the complexities of the problem, and also can kind of see through the greenwashing that where oftentimes corporations are portraying themselves as clean and green, but it's really just sort of a maintenance of the status quo. So people can take individual action by educating themselves, and learning about how these systems work, and learning about the kinds of solutions that they can invest themselves in. So I commend you for doing the work that you're doing, and the people who are listening to us here, that this is a really important thing, because there's a lot of disinformation out there. There's a lot of information that could make people feel disempowered. And so we really need to see through that and use our critical, creative, but also compassionate selves to chart the way forward.
Well, thank you. And that was a beautiful thought, but we have another minute if you want to, and then 30 seconds. I'll take the 30 seconds. You take the minute. Any last closing thought you want to use for the last minute before I say thank you to everyone?
Yeah. What to say? I mean, there is that, the phrase that, nobody has to do everything, but everyone has to do something. I really want people to take that in seriously. And I also think that, just those human connections, that if we kind of reach out, it can help us not feel so isolated. And it can really build resilience. That's another thing, maybe just the last thing, that with all these climate threats, one of the best helps for climate resilience and support is just a good functioning neighborhood where people look out for each
Yeah.
other and can share and make sure everyone's doing okay. So I just say for people to like invest in knowing your neighbors and building cooperation that way. That is simple but quite powerful.
So important. So important. It helps us break out of our isolation and our silos.
Mm-hmm.
Well, again, thank you, Dr. Jonathan London, so much. You will be back on this show when you can schedule it. This is an important thing to follow up on. And I also really want to thank our listeners and viewers, as you did, for paying attention, for caring, and encourage everyone to tune in next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And thanks our engineer, Rebel, and our producer, Dean. And may we all have enriching conversations in diversity and climate solutions this week.
Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart.